Hi there folks, I hope you're all well. So thank you again for tuning in. I don't say this as often as I should. I really do appreciate it when you watch my videos, so thank you for tuning in. Today's recipe, we're going to be looking at making a bell pepper lasagna. It is absolutely scrumptious. It is really lovely. There's a lot of moving parts in it, particularly if you're going to make all the things that I've made for this one, because this one has got my own bechamel sauce in it. It's also ended up breadcrumbs wise, I've had to make a bloomer loaf for this lasagna as well, because it turns out I had no shop bought bread left. So I made a wee bloomer loaf so I could chop off the end to use for the breadcrumbs on top. You don't need to go to all that hassle, you can use store-bought bread, but yeah, make your own bread actually gives a nicer breadcrumb on top as well, depending if you wanted to go that way. So before I ramble any further, let's crack on and let's make a lasagna. So the very first thing we're looking to prepare is 50 grams of dried mushrooms. I use a 2-to-1 mix of forest mushroom and porcini. It gives a nice flavour balance and it's a bit cheaper than going straight porcini. And to the mushrooms we're going to add 200 millilitres of boiled water and then cover it. In these times of COVID and Brexit, it's not always easy to find fresh produce. If you want, you can use frozen here as well. If it's fresh, we're looking at 225 grams of fresh spinach, and if we're using frozen, we're looking about 250 grams of frozen spinach. The frozen stuff obviously needs defrosted, the fresh stuff we're going to wilt. And from here, it's time to prep your onion. So we're either using 1 cannonball or 2 large onions. Cannonball is just one exceptionally large onion. We're going to deroot it, we're going to take the top off, we're going to half it, and then we're going to deskin it, and then we're going to rough chop it as we normally do. Which means cutting towards the root, but not actually cutting past the skin, so we've got a little bit attached, and then we're going to cut 90 degrees to that and get our chops going. And same as before, from a slightly different angle, we're just cutting towards where the root end is, but not cutting through, and then we're going to cut at a 90-degree angle to that. The thinner the cuts in both directions here, the finer the the finer the chop you've got. We're looking for a rough chop, so we don't need to be too close. And next on our preparation list is 2 bell peppers, red or orange, purely for colour because it looks nice in the lasagna. Going to take off the top, de-seed them, and then we're going to roughly chop these as well. So we will go through this again, but we're just going to basically julienne, which is the long cuts, our pepper, and then take the long cuts and 90-degree cut into the longs, and that's how we end up with our chops. So once again, we'll just repeat that. And again, from a slightly different angle, we again take the top off our bell pepper. We then remove the seeds and any of the pith that we don't want. The pith is edible, it's not too flavoursome, hence why I get rid of it. But get rid of the pith, and then we're going to half our bell pepper, julienne it, which is cut it into long lengths, and then we're going to turn 90 degrees and we're going to rough chop it down. And for the same reasons I've already mentioned, you can use crushed frozen garlic here, or you can use fresh cloves. Again, whatever you can get your hands on, due to the way Brexit has sometimes affected the supermarket shelves, and obviously how COVID is still affecting them as well. So if we're getting the fresh stuff, just press your knife blade down on it to release the skin after you've topped and tailed the garlic, and we're then going to rough chop it. Now, some people say add a little bit of salt when you're chopping. I've tried it. I'm still not sure if it makes a difference or not. Just that little sprinkle of salt on all your cloves. It's supposed to make it stop sticking to the knife. I'm on the fence. I don't know whether it helps or not. So that one's your choice. If you're using frozen garlic, we're going to use 1 block of crushed frozen garlic. No matter who the producer, manufacturer of them are, they all seem to equate to about 4 cloves of garlic. And the next thing that we need to prep is our red pesto. You can use it from a jar or you can make your own. I prefer to make my own. I make a batch, I then use ice cube trays to freeze them. My ice cube trays are luckily half a tablespoon each per measure, for a couple of different shapes as well, so it works out well. So I freeze them and then bring them out the freezer as I need them. It doesn't last as long, your fresh stuff, unless you freeze it compared to the jarred, because the jarred is full of preservatives, but the fresh stuff is nicer. So I'll show you a different recipe how to make it fresh if you want. And next up, we need to measure out 2 tablespoons of dried oregano into just a wee ramekin. And to the same ramekin, we're going to add 2 teaspoons of salt, just regular table salt, and half a teaspoon of black pepper.
Now, when it comes to your breadcrumbs, there are several options for you. Here I'm going with my own homemade bread, largely because I didn't have any store-bought bread in the house. If you're going to go with store-bought bread though, it tends to be your toasting breads. It tends to be about 2 of those thick slices will give you roughly 50 grams, and that's what we're looking for, is 50 grams roughly of breadcrumbs. If you don't want to make your own breadcrumbs though, you can actually buy them in the supermarkets. I don't like doing it because I have tools which allow me to take bread and turn it into breadcrumb, but you can go out and buy packeted breadcrumbs in your supermarkets. Now, if like me, you are going to whiz it through a food processor, I find it helps to break it up just slightly so that the tool can actually grab and cut much more effectively than trying to stick a whole slice of bread in there. Whether that's your homemade bread that you see here, or whether that is sliced bread out of a loaf bag. It's always easier just to break it up a little bit. And then it's just a quick whiz in your machine to break up the bread, get it down to a nice crumb texture. You're not looking to completely mush it into nothingness. You're looking for a reasonable amount of breadcrumb left over, which we'll see here in just a few seconds.
And now that all our prep work is done, we're ready to get on to the serious business of actually making the lasagna. Now, mentioned earlier, you've got options when it comes to your spinach. If you're using fresh spinach, now is the time to wilt your spinach. Do that by putting a colander over a boiling pot of water. Don't have the water high enough that's actually sitting in the colander. We're just looking to use the steam here to actually wilt it down. Put it into the actual colander, cover it with a lid that's larger than the pot, but not as large, not too large that it's much bigger than the top of your colander, just enough to actually trap the steam in there. Otherwise, if we're using frozen spinach, if it's not already been defrosted, stick it in your microwave on a defrost setting, defrost it, chop it down, remove any of the heavy stalks, which is exactly the same as we're going to do with the fresh spinach. Any heavy stalks, just get them out of there, and then we'll move on. So the spinach here has been wilted down nicely. Just take it onto your chopping board, chop it down. It's nicer in the lasagna if you do chop it. If you get any really heavy stalks, remove them. The size of stalks you see here are absolutely fine to leave, but bigger than that, just rip them out of there. Chop it down because it just spreads through your vegetable mix much nicer. And again, if we're using frozen, exact same procedure after it's been defrosted. You don't need to wilt the frozen stuff because it's wilted from the nature of actually being frozen. And now that the spinach is set aside, we're going to add 2 tablespoons of olive oil to our pan and bring that up to a medium-high heat. I didn't mention it, but this should be your largest saucepan. So once it's at temperature, if you don't know how to check if it's at temperature, just drop a little bit of onion in it, and if it sizzles, it's at temperature. Once it's at temperature, we're going to add all of our onion, and then we're going to add all of our bell pepper, give it a really good mix together, and then we're going to cook this for 5 minutes. And once your 5 minutes is up and your peppers and onions have softened down a bit, we're going to add everything else. So we're going to add our red pesto, we're going to add our chopped tomatoes. Tinned chopped tomatoes is perfectly fine, and it's my preferred way to go rather than de-skinning and chopping fresh tomatoes, because tinned tomatoes, I've mentioned in other videos, taste brilliant no matter what time of the year. Fresh tomatoes, if they're cooked off a season, might not always be just as nice, so tinned is my preference way to go. Also, we're adding our spinach, we're adding our seasoning, we're adding our salt and pepper. Everything else goes in. We're going to mix that together, and then we're going to cook this down for 15 minutes at a medium-y sort of heat again. Oh, and the mushrooms, forgot about them. And I probably didn't mention the garlic either. So, everything. So whilst our vegetable mixture is cooking down, we're going to heat up our bechamel sauce. You can use jarred stuff if you want. I much prefer my own. It's leaps and bounds ahead flavour wise compared to what you can get out of a jar. Get a separate recipe for that if you want to do it, otherwise just white sauce, bechamel sauce out of a jar. And we're going to add our goat's cheese to that and melt that down into our warmed bechamel sauce. And now that our vegetable mixture, our bechamel sauce are both ready, we're going to add layers of vegetables, sauce, and then pasta sheets. And we're going to repeat that for 4 layers of sauce, 4 layers of vegetable mixture, and 3 layers of pasta sheets. So you're putting about a quarter of your vegetable mixture in, repeat with the bechamel sauce, then put your pasta sheets across the top. It'll be 3 sheets, then a layer of vegetable sauce, back to the bechamel, 3 more sheets, repeat again, but this time probably with 4 sheets. But on your 4th sheet you may need to break it and cut it just so that it all fits over nice and evenly.
Now, one of the things we need to be very careful of is not going overboard. First few times that I made the lasagna, I kept putting too much sauce on the bottom layers and it would leave me very little for the top layers. So it's putting on enough to get a layer, but no more than that is all you're looking for. So if you're seeing a little bit of gapping at the bottom of your dish, you put a little bit more in, but not much. And the same goes with your bechamel sauce. You're just putting enough on to give it a nice covering. I found that 2 of my kitchen spoons are slightly different in volume, and the slightly larger one is better for putting in the bell pepper sauce, and the slightly smaller one is better for putting in the bechamel. And as you see, you're putting it in with the pasta sheets, you're putting 1 in each side and then placing your centre one, and that makes sure you're going to get an even fit. And again, a couple of scoops of it and then spread it out. You're not looking to put too much in, just enough to get that layerage without going overboard. And then you repeat this all the way up to the top. And rather than watching every layer get layered down, we're going to jump to the top layer where we're putting on our last pasta sheets. And due to the nature of the way the casserole dish I use anyway bellows out, the sheets don't cover it entirely. So our 4th sheet on this layer, we've snapped it so we can layer it along the edges. And then again, we put down our sauces, starting with the bell pepper sauce, then the bechamel, and then we will get on just shortly to the breadcrumbs. Now this particular layer, I tend to make it the thickest layer, not by much, but I certainly make the top layer before the breadcrumbs slightly thicker than the other layers. It's not much, it's a spoon and a half maybe of each, but it just adds a little bit more juiciness to the top layer, I feel. It's personal preference. You might want to try and get it really even across all, but I personally prefer the really thin layers and then just that slightly bit more on the final top layer. And once we have our layers down, we're adding our breadcrumbs right across the top of the last layer of the bechamel sauce. Once it's a nice good sprinkling covering the top of it entirely, we're going to take some spray oil and just lightly spray it across the top of the entire set of breadcrumbs, and that will just let it cook off really nicely and crisply when we put it into the oven. And into the oven it goes, in your middle shelf. We're going to cook it for 45 minutes at 190 degrees Celsius, and that's it, ready to be consumed right away if you're eating it then and there. But if you're not, you can also then let it cool for a little bit, cover it in tin foil, and then reheat it at your leisure. It's another big meal to make, so it's sometimes better to make in advance, and then you can consume it a couple of days later. So there we go. 1 lasagna. They aren't difficult, but there's a lot of moving parts, as I've said during the video. You don't need to make your own bechamel sauce. You don't need to make your own loaf just so you can scatter breadcrumbs on it. Those are optional. They do make a difference, especially the bechamel. They both make a major difference, to be honest. But the bechamel probably makes the biggest difference. So let's have a wee taste of this. You get it cut. I'm going to use my plate up here because otherwise I know what I'm like, and I'm going to have this end up hitting the deck. A real rich depth of flavours in this one. You've got all the flavours of your bell pepper sauce, all the flavours of the bechamel,
bechamel. I'm not actually sure the correct way to say it. Somebody tell me in the bottom, although it's typed, so I'm not sure how we've transferred that into me understanding the correct way to pronounce it. But there's such a depth, a roundness of flavours that all catch. It's a really, really lovely meal, but it is a bit more time consuming, but it's worth it. It really is worth it. So again, thank you for watching. I do appreciate it. It's really a pleasure to see you in the comments as well when you actually give me a wee bit of feedback. So take care, stay safe out there. All the best, folks.